I mean, I started writing about this before I knew the Guptas, and I'm really a Gupta because I wrote a column for the New Age for like I don't know how many times. I mean, I'm called an ANN7 analyst. I've been on that channel twice. The man who's always there, I think, is this one. And I'm thinking, okay, when is Professor Siepe going to be called a Gupta? Because he's always there. Yeah. But because he's not on Twitter, he's not paid Twitter. And I don't know, maybe he's respected, maybe that word professor in front means he can't be bought. I mean, I don't understand. I've only been on that channel twice. But you hear how, but it's just this momentum to just discredit everything around this report so that APSA never pays, And I feel sorry for people like Khaya, people who are minding their own business, living, and sometimes I think if I take some of his stuff and put it on my blog, before I know it, he's gonna be a Gupta. And and he might just get fired wherever he works, they've created this whole thing. It's so bitter, it's so horrible, but it actually means there is part of what we are doing that is really making people uncomfortable. And it's just a wonderful feeling, when I wake up and I go to Twitter and I've got 99 plus, and half of them are insults. I think, wow, I'm doing well. So in terms of the APSA issue, it is absolutely, it's not a work of fiction at all. In fact, having listened to Stephen, there's some stuff that Jeff has sent me, bombshells, absolute bombshells, which I think I will release tomorrow. Now that I've been here, I've been inspired. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Yeah, we live in very interesting times. Okay, so my name is Khaya, and I basically write for fun. And unfortunately, when I write for fun, I just have this thing of connecting dots. So I started writing about the APSA transaction in September. When was the president starting to pay back the money? After it did the whole VBS payment. And everybody was saying VBS is a problem. And then I said, well, actually the entire banking system is a problem. Just look at APSA for an example. So this was long before the Guptas became very prominent. So one of the key issues that people are asking now is that has the report been leaked so that it distracts the attention from the Guptas? And I said, well, I wrote about it in September 2015. Yeah. So I don't understand how it's got to do with the Guptas and all of that. But those are very minor issues. So I've just logged onto my cell phone now because I was actually in London last week and I tracked down Michael Oatley. So I had to find out a lot of things from him. And essentially, Michael Oatley's first response to me is that he actually has a non-disclosure agreement with the South African government. So it is impossible for the South African government to then say Michael Oatley writes fiction because they've paid him not to tell anybody what he knows, as it were. So I sent him what I'd written, and then he's like, yeah, interesting stuff, but I'm on the South African government's payroll not to say anything. So then that tells you just the picture of the story, or just how deep it goes. Anyway, one of the... yeah, hey, it's bad. Yeah, I was chatting to him I think last week, Tuesday, as it were. The key issues that we need to really talk about is that for me, I see the APSA conversation as an important conversation, particularly for APSA, as well. And how we need to be able to think about this is that the one thing that we all were given as a parting gift from apartheid is that Mandela imposed this idea of reconciliation upon people. And what that did is that it robbed people of the right to know particular things. And when we are robbed of the right to actually interrogate particular information, it is only inevitable that 20 or 25 years down the line, people will ask very simple questions and we can't answer them. And I really think that's where the whole transition went wrong. So when I looked at this particular situation, I was saying, in my view, ABSA cannot dispute the facts of what happened. The short history behind it is that the apartheid government had created a lot of banks, and these banks had been created on the premise that they wanted to elevate the poor white people into, the middle class. And in order to facilitate that, you look around the system, and back then the international banks used to run South Africa. So it was Barclays, Standard Chartered, Citigroup, and all of those things. So white people would go and they try and borrow money, and this bank would say the interest rate is 15%, and they said we can't afford it. So the Broederbond simply said, well, clearly that international banking system is not going to get us anywhere. Let us create our own banks. So those banks specifically said that in order to facilitate economic participation of our people, the interest rates that make it impossible for them must be ignored, and we must give them low interest rates. So that's how white people, the middle class, actually acquire their resources. So there's a very interesting dynamic that you must do when you compare the acquisition of property and the acquisition of wealth by white people. There is the explicit acquisition, which is when a farmer steals land. So that's easy to target. But then there's the implicit one, which enables a white person to go to a bank and get an interest rate of 5%, then I get an interest rate of 15% as well. So nobody's ever actually captured how that actually facilitated the mobility of white people into the middle class as they are today. So it wasn't really out of their own doing, just the fact that the system was created like that. So there were a lot of banks that were part of this. There was Trust Bank, Sand Bank, and all of these things. And Trust Bank was the most difficult of them all, because the guy that used to run it, Bill Mitchell, was essentially an idiot. So he used to advance a lot of really bad loans. And that was the bank that kept creating problems for the apartheid government because it kept failing. So if the bank keeps failing, then you decide either to bail it out or you let it fail. But the problem with letting a bank fail is that there's a risk that the people that have transacted with the bank will be left exposed. And if you don't want that to happen, then you need to have a conversation. And essentially, where it originally went wrong with the whole banking system under the apartheid government is that the way they had transacted is that they'd said, look, up in Gauteng and in the Vaal, you guys are going to be responsible for the banking network. So Volkskas was the main one. And then in the Cape, that's where the insurance companies would be based. But then Trust Bank was opened in the Cape. So when Trust Bank started failing, the question was, well, which of the Afrikaans network needs to deal with it? Is it the banking system, which is based primarily in Johannesburg, or is it the insurance, which is based in Cape Town? And the banking system in Johannesburg said, no, we're not going to bail out that bank because the problem was created in Cape Town. And the agreement between the various members of the Afrikaans network was that, Sanlam is going to be the leader in the insurance industry, and then the banking system is going to be led by Volkskas, and they're not allowed to compete with each other. So the idea was that if a bank fails, then Volkskas must deal with it. And if there's an insurance problem, then Sanlam is responsible for it. Now, the bank that failed was based in Cape Town. And then the bank here in Johannesburg, which was Volkskas, said, no, we're not going to bail out that bank because that's a Cape Town problem. So then Sanlam got involved in the banking system on the basis that Trust Bank needed to be rescued. So that's where it started. And as a consequence of that, then Sanlam started actually buying up all the failing banks, as it were, that were part of the Afrikaans network, and they put them into a group, and they called that group Bank Op, as it were. So it was essentially the banking corporation. So around 1985, the sum of these banks, now that you put them together, remember it was after the Rubicon speech. So after the Rubicon speech, then you've got a whole lot of currency problems. And suddenly interest rates made it impossible even for the Afrikaans middle class to actually afford anything. So then that network of banks started failing. And then the government said, we can't allow them to fail on the basis that we allowed PW Botha to say a speech that actually made the problem. So then they said, we need to bail them out. So it's that type of SAA bailout that you guys hear about. The difference between the SAA bailouts that you have now is that SAA actually doesn't take money from National Treasury. But you're not going to hear this when you read the newspaper. They simply get given a piece of paper which is say, if you guys need to go and borrow 100 million rand and a person doesn't trust that you'll be able to pay it back, then we'll step in. So it's never actually exchanged cash between National Treasury and SAA. But in 1985, they actually did give away 300 million rand to the banking system. So they took money from the Reserve Bank and then they said, here's 300 million rand, you must sort out your problem. So that's the difference between the 1985 situation and the current situation. But the way people hear it, it's like SAA is the biggest problem in the country. Then I say, actually, National Treasury has never given SAA a single cent. They simply give them a letter to say, if people think you can't pay it back, tell them that you got a big brother. That's really how a bailout works, a guarantee works. 1985, they gave them 300 million. And obviously, the question was, how do you make this feasible for them? So, as Steven said, you say to a person, please borrow me 300 million rand, and you're going to charge me interest of 1%. So, I'm going to pay you 3 million rand in interest. What I'll do is that I'll give back the money to you because now it's mine. I'll lend it back to you, but then I'll charge you 18% on your own money. So then I make this profit of 17%. And it's perfectly legitimate because money exchange hands, as it were. So, what the Afrikaans our government did very well is that they put people in places that made all the transactions really acceptable. So for them, it wasn't the fact that they wanted to do things illegally. They wanted to do things legally, but the people that had to sign them off had to understand what the context was. So if you then want to facilitate that particular transaction, you can't have Khaya being the guy that signs it off and then he says, I don't agree with this, because he says it makes no sense. So you have to put someone in place who understands the entire mandate, who will then say, let us make it happen. So that's what created the legal sham behind it. So you're going to struggle if you go to court and then you say this was illegal, because they'll say, well, technically the person who was supposed to sign it off was the Reserve Bank governor, and he did. So you struggle on the technical merits, on the technical legal arguments. So that was the 1985 transaction. They went for about 5 years, and then in 1990, again, it happened. Because the problem with being unable to run a bank is that if I lend you 10 rand today, tomorrow you're still unable to run a bank. So 16 days later, they were even in bigger trouble. So they go back to the Reserve Bank, and then they say, we need more money.